I adjusted my coat as I left the bar, the chilly night air sinking in. It had been one of those nights that promised warmth, but delivered only nostalgia and exhaustion. My friends had smiled and chatted, each offering moments of laughter, yet there was a sense of disconnection that lingered. She was still caught between worlds, trying to be a part of life, yet drowning in her studies, forever haunted by the memories of her past. I pulled out my phone and called a taxi, my fingers trembling slightly against the cold metal. Within a few minutes, the taxi rolled up to the curb, its headlights flickering as if the car itself were alive, blinking and assessing me. The driver, an unusually pale man with dark eyes hidden behind the shadows of his cap, didn't meet her gaze. I climbed into the back, settling in and giving my address with the kind of ease that comes from hundreds of similar late-night rides. The car moved quietly, the night seeming to stretch on forever as the streets passed by in a blur of dim lights and hushed sounds. I rested my head against the window, eyes closed, lost in thoughts of my dissertation on trauma, specifically my own unresolved fears that I had buried long ago. But something shifted when the driver spoke, his voice a low whisper, barely audible over the engine's hum. "Do you still remember the nightmares? The ones with the empty room and the man at the door?" he asked, his voice almost conversational. My eyes flew open, my pulse quickening. She hadn't heard that voice in years, and certainly not in this context. It felt like the voice had come from somewhere she knew too well, like the recesses of her own mind. My reflection in the window looked back at me with a touch of disbelief and mounting fear. "What?" she whispered, her voice shaky. The driver didn't turn. His hands remained rigid on the wheel, staring straight ahead, navigating the winding streets of the empty city as he continued, each word pricking into her like a thorn. "You're scared of failing again, aren't you, Claire? Just like in high school, that one time you never told anyone about," he murmured, his eyes never meeting hers in the rearview mirror. How did he know? My throat tightened, a lump forming. She forced herself to breathe slowly, trying to calm her racing thoughts, rationalizing the impossibility. Maybe one of her friends was playing a cruel joke on her. It had to be. No one knew these things, not these secrets, not the things she had buried so deeply even she had forgotten some of them. The streetlights flickered erratically, like an old film reel stuttering through broken frames, and Claire's stomach churned as if the taxi were suddenly unmoored from the world outside. The car's GPS screen blinked and changed, the familiar city map dissolving into a loop, an endless labyrinth leading to a single destination, a dark alley she couldn't escape. "You think you can just forget the past?" The driver's voice took on an almost taunting tone now. His face was hidden, but she could sense the malevolence behind his voice, the way his whispers reached into her mind, twisting memories and pulling them to the forefront. Her childhood fear of being alone in the dark, the taunts of her high school bully, the shame she felt in her first relationship when her ex left without explanation, all of them came rushing back like a tide, suffocating her in their intensity. I grabbed my phone, fumbling to call for help. The screen was blank, no signal, only the looping red line of the GPS route, circling and returning, an unending repetition trapping her in place. "Let me out," I shouted, yanking at the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. The driver, with painstaking slowness, finally turned his head towards her. His face changed, shifting like a broken mirror, showing fragmented reflections. Her father's disappointment, her bully's sneer, her ex-boyfriend's indifference. I gasped, my entire body trembling. The world outside the window twisted, the interior of the taxi dissolving, reforming into the familiar yet dreaded walls of her childhood home. She blinked, and the back seat was suddenly her high school hallway, lockers on either side, each door slamming shut as the whispers grew louder, echoing, repeating, mocking. I squeezed my eyes shut, my nails digging into my palms. She had to confront this. She couldn't run. Not anymore. The car, or whatever it was feeding off her fear, and she needed to face it. This was no ordinary taxi. It was her fear, her darkest memories given form, pulling her deeper into herself, into the past she never wanted to confront. I took a breath, trying to steady myself. "I'm not afraid of you," she whispered, though her voice cracked. The whisper stopped. The oppressive air seemed to ease, just for a moment. The world around her shifted again. The taxi's seats were beneath her. The streetlights outside glowed steadily. Her heartbeat slowed, her breaths deepened, and the whispers receded like a tide pulling back from the shore. The next thing I knew, I was waking up in my apartment. Disoriented, she struggled to recall how she got there, her head heavy and her body aching as if she had been running for hours. Sunlight was filtering through the curtains. My phone buzzed on the table. Messages from my friends asking why I never made it home. I glanced towards the window, the unmistakable sound of an idling taxi drifting up from the street below. Slowly, she moved towards the window, peeking out through the curtains. There it was, the same taxi, its headlights flickering as if winking at her. Her pulse quickened, her stomach clenched. She turned away, forcing herself to breathe. I wasn't running anymore. Story 2. The night was supposed to be ordinary, maybe even dull, just another late shift at the club. The kind of night Kev Richards could stumble through, exhausted but assured of the same routine. Clock out, hop into a cab, and head back to his little apartment on the edge of the city. But tonight, the air carried a strange stillness, like something waiting just outside the door, just out of sight. Kev lit a cigarette as he stepped out into the damp night, the echoes of muffled club music already fading behind him. He dialed for a cab, rubbing his temple. The neon buzz of city life didn't even touch this side street. Here, shadows pulled at the corners, stretching across cracked pavement under flickering streetlights. The taxi pulled up with a quiet rumble. It wasn't the usual kind. Older, boxier, like it belonged in a movie from the 70s. The driver barely acknowledged him, only tilting his hat, an old-fashioned chauffeur's cap, as Kev opened the door. Kev slid into the back seat, the scent of worn leather and something else, something metallic, filling his nose. He glanced up at the rearview mirror, but only caught a hint of the driver's face. Shadows shielded his eyes, leaving just the sharp line of his jaw. Whatever. Kev had seen stranger things in his line of work. "Hey, boss. Just heading to Jefferson and 9th, Kev said, trying to read the guy's vibe. He got no response, not even a nod. Kev sighed and let his head fall back against the seat, letting the cab ride carry him through the city's winding veins. Silence swelled, wrapping the cab in a heavy kind of unease, the kind that made Kev's skin prickle. He tapped his fingers against his knee, glancing around for a distraction. The radio crackled, sudden static breaking the silence. A cold voice sliced through, detailing a string of brutal killings, each one involving an unlicensed taxi. Kev shifted in his seat, an icy trickle of anxiety spreading through his gut. "Man, that's some messed up stuff," Kev muttered, half expecting some reaction from the driver. Nothing. The man remained stiff, his hands gripping the wheel with mechanical precision. Kev glanced out the window, his sense of direction twisting in uncertainty as unfamiliar warehouses replaced the scattered lights of the city blocks. They were headed somewhere else, somewhere wrong. "Hey, buddy, you're going the wrong way," Kev said, leaning forward, tension tightening his voice. The driver didn't blink, didn't shift. The old cab hummed along, the locks clicking shut with a mechanical snap. Kev's heart hammered in his chest. He grabbed for his phone, but the signal bars were gone. Even the clock seemed frozen, a digital glitch stuck on 3:33 a.m. The GPS screen showed symbols, weird shapes that didn't make any sense. Kev's throat went dry. He could feel something, that awful knowing feeling deep in his bones. Something was coming. He looked at the driver again, and in that instant, the man turned, his face catching the dim red glow of the dashboard lights. His eyes were wild, scarred lines twisted down his cheek like angry rivers. And then he moved, lunging with a glint of silver in his hand. Kev threw himself sideways, pain jolting through his arm as the knife sliced the air just inches from him. Kev didn't think. He just reacted. He slammed his elbow against the window, glass shattering under the force. Cold air rushed in, mixing with the metallic scent of fear. He scrambled out, rolling onto the gravel of the warehouse lot, his knees scraping against the ground as he pushed himself up. Behind him, the cab door swung open, the driver stepping out, his silhouette dark against the headlights that flickered on and off like a heartbeat. Kev ran. He bolted between stacks of rusted crates and metal drums, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The taxi followed, engine growling, headlights casting erratic beams across the cracked concrete. It wasn't just a chase. It was like a nightmare given life, every instinct in Kev screaming that this wasn't about money or carjacking. This was something darker, something that hungered for more than just fear. He ducked behind a stack of crates, his back pressed to the cold steel as he tried to steady his breathing. The engine rumbled closer, the flickering light casting long shadows around him. Kev's eyes darted around, searching for anything, something to fight back, some way out. He spotted it, a stack of crates teetering above on a forklift platform. It was a gamble, a desperate one. Kev waited, his body trembling, until the headlights swung directly toward him. Then he moved, throwing a rusted wrench he'd grabbed at the release lever of the forklift. The crates toppled, crashing down onto the taxi with a deafening roar, the engine sputtering, lights blinking out like dying stars. Dust filled the air and Kev coughed, stumbling backward, his heart pounding in his ears. He took a breath, a shaky, terrified breath, thinking maybe, just maybe, it was over. But then he heard it, the soft rumble of an engine, slow and deliberate. He turned, and his stomach dropped. Another taxi, identical to the first, rolled silently into view, its headlights clicking on, illuminating him like prey caught in the open. Kev's eyes widened, his legs moving before his mind could even catch up. He sprinted into the dark maze of the industrial lot, the phantom driver close behind. A relentless shadow that wouldn't stop, that couldn't be escaped, not until the night itself swallowed him whole. Story 3. The wilderness always held a special allure for me. The quiet whisper of the wind through the trees, the infinite stretch of untouched nature, and the thrill of the unknown. That's why I was out here, deep in a remote national park. The end of another exhausting but exhilarating week of hiking. It had been perfect until now. Nothing but me, the trails, and the occasional group I met along the way. I was looking forward to the comfort of a city again, even if just for a few days. A taxi back to civilization from the small town at the edge of the park was all I needed. Simple, right? I flagged down a car, the only one I'd seen for miles, a beat-up old taxi with faded yellow paint. The driver looked harmless enough, an older man, the kind whose face seemed to be carved from stone, with hands that spoke of years of hard work. He grunted a greeting as I climbed into the back seat, my muscles aching in the comforting way they always did after a long hike. The ride started off smooth, the tires humming along the winding road that led out of the park. I leaned back, watching the familiar pines blur past, the exhaustion slowly pulling my eyelids down. It felt good to finally sit, to let someone else take over the responsibility of movement. But after a while, I realized we weren't heading in the direction I had expected. The driver took a sharp right, veering off the main road and onto a narrow gravel path that wound its way deeper into the forest. "Shortcut," he said, his voice rough, like gravel scraping over pavement. My phone had lost signal miles back, but I wasn't too worried. Locals always knew their way around better than the map apps anyway. As the minutes passed, my unease grew. The dense canopy opened up, replaced by patches of open wilderness. The path narrowed, turning into a muddy track barely wide enough for the car. The tires slipped and lurched, the car struggling to keep moving forward. "Are you sure this is the right way?" I asked, trying to sound calm. The driver didn't respond. He just glanced at me through the rearview mirror, his lips curling into the barest hint of a smile, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. The sun dipped lower, the daylight fading into that eerie twilight where everything starts to lose its shape. My stomach twisted as I noticed the strange markers lining the side of the track. Stones arranged in odd, ritualistic patterns. Something primal inside me screamed that this wasn't right, that I needed to get out. I leaned forward, my voice shaky. "Hey, seriously, turn around. I want to go back." He ignored me, his eyes fixed straight ahead, the smile growing ever so slightly. My pulse raced, the realization hitting me like ice water. This wasn't a shortcut. He wasn't taking me back. The car jerked to a stop in front of a cabin that seemed to grow out of the shadows. The doors clicked as the locks engaged. He got out without a word, slamming his door shut. I watched him walk towards the cabin, his silhouette growing darker as he got further away. The guttural sounds drifting from the cabin were not human, a chorus of unsettling voices that made my skin crawl. Panic surged. I needed to get out, now. My hands shook as I grabbed the metal bar at the base of the window, slamming it against the glass. The sound of it shattering cut through the quiet like a gunshot. The cold night air rushed in as I scrambled through the broken window, cutting my hands on the shards but not caring. My heart pounded in my ears, adrenaline pushing me to move faster, to run. I plunged into the forest, the branches clawing at my clothes, my breath coming in short gasps. The whispers followed me, closing in from all directions. Shapes moved just beyond my line of sight, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. My mind raced with questions. Who were they? What were they? But there was no time for answers, only escape. I ran until my legs burned, until I could hardly breathe, until I thought I had lost them. I stopped, leaning against a tree, the forest silent around me. Then I saw it, the taxi, sitting in the clearing ahead, just as I had left it. My stomach dropped as if the earth had disappeared beneath me. No matter which way I ran, I always seemed to end up here. The driver was inside, waiting, his face partially illuminated by the dim overhead light. His eyes, they weren't human. They glowed a sickly yellow, like those of the creatures that had stalked me through the woods. He smiled at me, wider this time, his teeth too sharp, too many. I turned and ran again, my mind a blur of terror. The whispers grew louder, circling around me, herding me back, always back to the same place. The cabin, the car, the driver, the wilderness, which had once been my escape, was now my prison.